Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. For those of you that study and follow American politics and policy, you'll be aware of the fact that he's been at the center of this country's debate over guns ever since the Sandy Hook shooting back in the 2010s. He has, however, been involved recently in another intellectual project near and dear to the heart of this show. He's looking into this question of to what degree does the increasing amount of loneliness, the increasing lack of meaning, and this broader spiritual crisis, as many have described it, the result of America's economic system and the overall breakdown in the neoliberal world order that's affecting countries across the developed world. So in this conversation, we get into a bunch of big topics, everything from to what degree is there a race between the right and left to be more populist and deliver more outcomes for this up for grabs body in this country's politics. And then we, of course, then get into this other broader question of what that actual agenda should look like as we look at these issues moving forward in the wake of Donald Trump's 2024 election. Great conversation. We reference a bunch of pieces that Senator Murphy has written or contributed to. You can find those linked in the show notes. A huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation supporting the work of this podcast. Senator Chris Murphy, welcome to the Realignment.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to chat with you. So after the 2024 election, you said that American politics is essentially a race between Democrats and Republicans to put together the most compelling economic populist agenda for the working class. I'd love to hear why you think that's the centerpiece of our political system right now.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago, there was this song that went viral on the right, Rich Men North of Richmond. And it was, this guy kind of looked and sounded like a pretty typical Trumper. His song included some kind of QAnon-friendly lyrics and some pretty traditional conservative tropes, blaming people's problems on, welfare queens. But it also involved some attacks on capitalism and a sort of call for, there to be real accountability for corporations who had made work soulless and had made everything about profit. The song went viral, not on the left, it went viral on the right. And I said publicly, man, this guy sounds like somebody, and his listeners sound like the kind of people Democrats should be talking to, because if they really care about the oligarchy and if they really care about how soulless work has become and how it doesn't pay the bills, then Democrats have the answers, not Republicans. And I got shouted down for it. Why? Because this guy did have some kind of right-sounding views, and there were probably some racists amongst his listeners. And I was just told, we don't talk to people like that. If somebody's not aligned with us on every single social and cultural issue, if they don't believe what we believe on guns and climate change, then we're not going to really be in a conversation with them about economics. But to me, it was proof that even on the sort of what we broadly categorize as the right, people who might not agree with me on guns, there's a lot of people interested in hearing about how government can hold greedy corporations accountable, how they can help make work pay, and how they can address the economy, which is rigged against anybody who wants to sort of be an entrepreneur and start a small business. And I just think that group is there for the taking for the left. But that means you've got to get into a conversation with them. That means you have got to kind of be a little bit of a bigger tent party. You can't be as judgmental about people who might not, be ready to endorse the things we believe in when it comes to climate or gay rights. But that's how you grow a coalition, is by opening yourself up to people who are not aligned with you on 100% of your issues.
I'm glad you put the words greedy and corporations in sentences next to each other, because I've been really fascinated by this dynamic since 2022. When inflation started, senators such as Elizabeth Warren put this greedflation narrative at the top of the sort of Democratic left of center response, and it just didn't hit. And I'm just fascinated by how on paper, giving every single thing you said, you'd think that would have been an effective message, but it didn't work. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Well, it didn't work because the party didn't carry the message. And the party has not been broadly and aggressively populist for a very long time. And I can talk about the reasons why that is. It's in part a legacy of the sort of Obama era Democratic Party that became very enamored with markets and market forces as a way to solve problems. It's in part because we just have become a higher income coalition. And so as you become a higher income coalition, you're kind of less interested in more populist, more sort of class-based rhetoric. And it's in part because, we take money from the folks who run a lot of these big corporations, and we're friendly with a lot of the people who run their government relations offices. But I actually agree. Had we had a coordinated message about how these corporations were using the pandemic and the aftermath of the pandemic to jack up prices, to drive up profits, we at least would have had a chance at surviving the Republican narrative, which was that Democrats caused inflation and the Democratic spending is what made it worse.
See, this is interesting. I kind of disagree with you because, and not in like a traditional center left, I'm triggered by talk about populism sense, but more just because if you're talking about the Oliver, Anthony, north of Richmond audience, I spent a lot of time because I, spent a couple of years doing Breaking Point. So I talked with a lot of those people. Yep. And what I just noticed is that if you basically put up the proposition, okay, it's these greedy corporations that are doing things, or it's government, it's Joe Biden spending all this money, it's government being out of touch, people are just reflexively in these sort of alternate media spaces, given how low trust everything is, reflexively, I'd say just putting government as the source of all problems higher up on the list here. So I'm not disagreeing with your policy analysis. I'm just curious how you think about like that, because I think you and I both spend a lot of time thinking about the contradictions that exist within that audience.
Oh, no, I think you're right. But you're right because you are introducing an argument standing side by side against a legacy argument, right, that has been reinforced by a coordinated conservative anti-government ecosystem for decades. So I'm not suggesting that you are going to overnight be able to, win over, the Richmond, north of Richmond listeners with an argument that government can actually play a more activist role to smooth out the rough edges of the economy. But you can if you make that argument in a coordinated way over time, and if the left builds the kind of information, the permanent information ecosystem that the right has had at its disposal for decades. So this is a project, but so I think we're saying the same. Well, I don't know. I'm agreeing with you that if you just sort of say, well, it's the greedy corporations, somebody that has been listening for decades to the argument that it's the government is not going to believe you. But if we spend 5 years explaining exactly how the corporations have rigged the rules to destroy downtowns, to destroy entrepreneurism, to make work feel so meaningless and soulless, to explain the way that profit has trumped every value that we grew up believing defined us as a country, then I think we have a shot, but you got to put in the work.
Yeah, well said. So then we don't disagree then, because there's, the Monday morning quarterbacking is easy, and it's just easy to imagine. Because what I don't like about the sort of post-2024 discourse is this sort of treating political arguments like you could just like insert them. So, if we'd like sprinkle the phrases greedflation 5x more times, you're arguing that this is like and this is why we're both interested in the neoliberalism project and these long-term, like these are long-standing things there. So no actual disagreement. So next question. I read Patrick Ruffini's Party of the People book over the break, and listeners will know I had Patrick Ruffini on. I will confess I didn't actually read the book when I talked to him in 2023, and that was unfortunate because this was a very good book and it was a very helpful book. And he starts out the book by saying the diploma divide, the higher ed gap, is just the centerpiece of American politics, and all of our assumptions need to sort of start from there. What is your thought on that thesis? It informs how I'm thinking about everything moving forward. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'd have to understand what he believes flows from that. I mean, of course, if you just look at the voter data, it is true that higher educated voters, who also tend to be higher income voters, are increasingly at the center of our coalition, and and voters with lower levels of education, and by virtue of that, lower incomes are voting for Republicans. Again, I think that the folks who have been on the outside, who have not gotten the benefit that you get from a college degree, and it's just true that you get a benefit from it, who still believe that, like, the America they remember didn't require you to have the college degree. You could still lead a good life with a high school degree or some extra degree, but not a 4-year degree. Feel like the deal that they thought existed doesn't work any longer, and they're interested in blowing the status quo up and replacing it with something fundamentally different. And so for that crowd, they're going to vote for the progressive party, meaning the party that's actually going to progress beyond the status quo. And they came to believe that the Republican Party was the progressive party, right? The Republican Party was the party that was actually more interested in destroying the status quo and replacing it with something new. The Democratic Party in this last election became identified with defending the status quo, and that includes democracy itself. Those voters ultimately didn't believe that they were being heard by the existing democratic system. And so when Kamala Harris went out and said, the centerpiece of my campaign is defending democracy, those voters who have felt left behind, in part because of the inability to get what you get through a very expensive college degree, weren't really interested in anybody defending the existing version of democracy.
Yeah, and a couple of things there. So just number one, like, very well taken on the democracy point. So I work as the editorial producer at PBS on a public affairs show. And something I just noticed, how I'm in this alternate media space, but I'm also in this very establishment space. Every other episode, every other week, no offense to my bosses, is democracy, January 6th, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just know that, like, these younger audiences are just, like, not exposed or not interested in those topics. They're not watching MSNBC. They're not reading the Washington Post, not reading the New York Times. So just, like, the democracy rhetoric meant something to a very specific audience that isn't going to translate necessarily. And then the second piece here, and this is where I think the Patrick Ruffini thesis is helpful, is it just adds another dimension to our politics. So if the diploma divide is near the center of everything, it means that if you're looking, so I'm in Austin, I'm in Texas, if I'm looking at a Latino guy in his, like, early 20s that didn't go to college in, South Texas, I'm not going to sort of start with the operative analysis of, like, okay, he's Hispanic, therefore he's a part of the Democratic coalition automatically. Because actually it turns out that in a bunch of different circumstances, he actually weirdly has a lot more in common with a non-college educated white guy who also, like, is feeling down in Appalachia. So that's, I think, why it's such a useful frame for orienting ourselves. Next big question, Aaron, give me a quick second to articulate this properly, because I think it's useful for me, you, and the audience. So if you're arguing that the working class economics is going to be at the center, I want to channel J.D. Vance for a second and sort of offer up sort of my interpretation of what the pitch is. I'd love to get your thoughts on what the Republican populist working class pitch is, and then hear what you think the sort of counter or Democratic alternative is. So one, immigration. We're going to deport low-skilled illegal immigrants who corporations use to keep wages low and raise the price of housing. Two, we're going to pull Bill Clinton in reverse and triangulate on entitlement programs. We're fine with Social Security. We're not going to touch Obamacare. We're fine with Medicare. And if a red state passes a minimum wage increase, we're not going to go to our fainting couch with screams about Milton Friedman. Labor, we're going to see nice things about unions. We're going to appear at a picket every once in a while, like Senator Josh Hawley did. And even though we're not going to really have the right technical National Labor Relations Board appointments, we're going to talk about culture and the ways that we are in sync with the union membership. Lastly, trade and industry. We're going to reshore American industry via tariffs, and we're going to deregulate. Also, by the way, college sucks. You don't want to have to go there in the first place. That's really what the aggressive pitch is. And what I love about the pitch, just from a pure political perspective, is it perfectly wields econ policy with, like, cultural critiques. College sucks. Immigrants are taking things from you, and Democrats want those immigrants to have things over you. What do you just think about this pitch overall? Because I think this is the 2028 play that's going to come down the line.
Yeah, but it's not the 2025 play. I mean, the reality is that, J.D. Vance is not in charge, and he has some interesting things he has said, but what are they lining up to do? They're lining up to pass a massive tax cut for billionaires, millionaires, and corporations. And how are they going to pay for it? They're going to pay for it by cuts to Medicaid and Medicare. Right? That's the deal that they came to get out of town in December. They promised that we'll vote for the continuing resolution as long as we get a guarantee that the way we pay for the tax cuts for the wealthy is by slashing healthcare programs for poor people and for seniors. That is a disaster for the American public. It is a political gift for Democrats because poor people in this country, middle-class voters who have maybe been skeptical of Democrats, who have been willing to give Republicans a shot, are not going to like the fact that the centerpiece of the economic agenda is robbing from the middle class and the poor and seniors to pad the pockets of the rich. And so I also don't think they're going to do anything to help labor. They're going to put somebody in charge of the Department of Labor who is mildly friendly, but they will not move the PRO Act. The NLRB will be in the hands of the corporate, the oligarchs. The FTC is being handed to Wall Street. So we are no longer going to have an FTC that is, really caring on a daily basis about the kind of consolidation and market non-competitiveness that hurts workers. For instance, the rule, the non-competes rule that's been really good for workers will be cast aside. So I don't think you're going to see you're not going to see any significant pro-worker policy, and you're going to see traditional kind of Reagan-esque trickle-down economics. So whatever J.D. Vance was running on or plans to run on in 2028 is not going to be what dominates the narrative on economics in 2025.
And I'll say too, and this is really the Republicans under Trump now have the same problem that Democrats have, which is that when you have an unwieldy coalition to get to your majority, the contradictions start to emerge. And I think that I'm in this weird place where I actually like the idea of DOGE. I like just the idea of let's put this idea front and center in a very consumable, very understandable way. I think DOGE broke through in a way that typical government appointments and government-centric ideas don't do. So that's the part that I like. But the disastrous part, if you're trying to do the right populist pitch here, is that Elon and Vivek kicked off by saying Social Security and Medicare are these big disasters, which, by the way, isn't a government efficiency question. So you've already had a bit of mission creep there. So I'd just like you to talk about the contradictions within the coalition that Trump assembled by taking everyone anti-establishment. Yes, that equals, the majority of the vote, but it doesn't necessarily produce a winning populist governing agenda.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't know why we have sort of pretended like the Department of Government Efficiency is on the level. I mean, obviously it's not a department. It's just a task force. It's probably just a TV show. I mean, it's probably actually going to have no impact. And if it does have impact, what will it be if there are two conflicted billionaires who are in charge of it? I mean, Elon Musk is a billionaire because of government policy. And he is going to be interested in cutting other people's subsidies and maintaining his subsidies. He's going to be interested in having a hand in foreign policy because he makes tons of money from China. And he does not want the rift with China to include any friction when it comes to the profits he pulls out of that market. So you have put in charge of a big government spending initiative two people who are massively conflicted. One person who is likely just getting himself close to Donald Trump in order to steal from all the rest of us. So I kind of don't love the fact that a lot of my colleagues are pretending like this is a legitimate effort. I think it's either just going to be for show, or if they actually start making recommendations that get implemented, it's just going to be in service of helping the billionaires who are, essentially trying to turn our government into a kleptocracy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with everything operational you're describing, but I do just want to push back on the, is it going to just be a TV show? Because I think if you look at the Biden administration, one of the big lessons I've just taken is just that, even the Lena Khan stuff, right? So the non-competes, she just made it so that you could automatically cancel your gym membership. I saw that blow up on Reddit. There are all these things that they did that just for a variety of reasons, if you're the type of government official who gets a Lena Khan type job, you are just not actually set up to compete in the media environment around. And if I could just magically give myself a job 4 years ago in the Biden administration, I would honestly just create a quasi-fake, quasi-TV Department of Worker Freedom, where you'd put someone like Mark Cuban, who has really high favorables with the audience we're talking about in, and his only job would be to take like a fake $1 a year job like it's World War II and say, hey, you know what we did this week? We made it so that your Planet Fitness membership is fixed. So I just think that there's something you could merge performative fakeness with the tangibility if there's something underneath it.
Listen, I actually, once again, I don't know that we're disagreeing here. Listen, I submit that Donald Trump is a master marketer. I mean, I don't know what day this is airing, but in the last 24 hours,
next week,
the news cycle has been consumed in the 24 hours before we tape this with the pending invasion of Greenland. And that's brilliant, right? Because like, that's a super interesting topic. It kind of makes Americans feel good to, feel like we're, back into the world of expanding our influence at a moment when it just feels like our influence is contracting. And most importantly, it distracts from, the real threats, the tax cut that's going to go to billionaires, the Kash Patel nomination that may spell the end of our democracy. So no, I am envious of how Trump commands news cycles. And I don't deny that there are some things that Democrats should learn.
Yeah, and I think I agree with your point around sort of taking DOGE too literally is going to lead to tears and not dishonor, but sort of silliness on everyone's part. But what I was focused on, like your TV comment is, I would basically say that whenever I have Democratic policymakers on, my basic suggestion is like, okay, like what is your version of DOGE? Because DOGE just as a concept, this idea that, hey, like, in today's media environment, you can just say you're doing things. It's like there's a yes. creativity to the idea of DOGE that I think I want to hear more from Democratic policymakers that don't require us to then endorse the 99.8% of it that's silly.
And listen, we're engaged in politics, right? I mean, yes, and part of politics is passing policy, but part of politics is building coalitions and communicating. And like, that's the problem that we have to solve for. And we mentioned this earlier, Marshall, but I just sort of put another pin in it. A lot of this is nuts and bolts. I mean, they have an information infrastructure that is just really impressive. A lot of it is paid for and constructed through sort of billionaire subsidy. But DOGE becomes immediately in the zeitgeist, in part because it gets thrown into a really enormous echo chamber. And that doesn't happen with us. So even though we did come up with a good idea, it just doesn't ultimately get reflected in the ways that their ideas get reflected, because we haven't paid to build the media infrastructure on the left that they've built on the right.
I want to come back to the original point I made when I was articulating sort of the J.D. Vance 2028 pitch, because I agree with you around the lens of the actual how do you get there is going to be incredibly difficult. But I just want to go back to the fact that the Republican working class pitch, when articulated properly, does merge the culture with the economics when it comes to then critiquing the status quo. And I worry in the post-election sort of, we're all going to try to be left populist now. Too many Democrats have acted like, okay, so the solution to a populist moment is we're going to show up in forgotten parts of the country or vulnerable swing districts and say universal health care 3 times fast and expect that that is going to be the actual answer, when I think just treating these as pure dollar and cents, how do we deliver things to people, misses it. So I'd love to hear what you think about that dynamic.
No, I agree. I mean, I've ruffled feathers because I have sort of made this argument. We have got to be more comfortable with people in our coalition who don't agree with us on all these social and cultural issues. And how do you do that? You don't do that just by saying it, right? You do that by nominating candidates who, may ultimately not be in complete agreement on choice and gay rights and climate. You do that by going and talking to audiences that are going to be hostile to you on some of these questions. I also have another critique, which I don't know if you share or not, but there's a difference between subsidy and unrigging. We have been a party very focused on subsidy, and so the student loan cancellation, the child tax credit, the enhanced Obamacare subsidies, they changed people's lives. They helped a lot of people. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think they got us much political credit at all. Because while people appreciate a little cash, a handout, they really want to be empowered to succeed on their own. They want the rules of the economy to be unrigged, so that when they go to work, they make more. When they start a small business, they have a better opportunity to succeed. So I think we've got to, as we become populists, right? We can't just be wealth transfer populists, right? We've got to be rule unrigging populists. And there's a difference between the two. And Democrats have been pretty heavy on subsidy in the last few years. And I just don't think that that has won us a lot of political points.
You know, there's a real lesson in what you just said, which is that when you articulate this on a podcast, everything you said made sense. If I remember a few weeks ago when you made this point and you referenced handouts, like it goes viral on Twitter and everyone's sort of mad. So we should be thinking hard about what formats, and you clearly are like more than prepared to be like dunked on Twitter, but just sort of what formats should shape our thoughts. I don't think any policymaker should be like letting Twitter set the bounds of how they think about things. But I also want to just say, given what you just articulated here, I'll bring up another story from the Patrick Ruffini book, which I really suggest you read, where he was talking about these like Latino South Texas communities, and they were talking about the handout points. So like we totally agree on this. They were talking about, so the question was basically, where do you see Democrats missing it when it comes to populism? They're like, oh, like we think all these like subsidies and these like ideas are good, but they basically only speak to us as if we're just sort of like impoverished Latinos with no aspirations. And I don't just want a child tax credit. I don't just want healthcare. I actually I have a small business and I want to be able to do things and I want to be able to feel like I could win. And when you just talk to people purely in these like deliverists, we're going to give you all these things, it just misses half of the way that people actually think about their actual lives. And you have to be able to articulate. And this is what I think right populism does. When J.D. Vance says, hey, I'm against the, college debt forgiveness, not just because I'm a miserly, like rich guy, but because college actually sucks. And you don't want to have to go to college to pursue the American dream. I'm not saying I agree with that, but I think it speaks to an actual thought. I have plenty of right-wing family members. They don't like college. They love telling my younger brother-in-law, you know what, if you'd gone and done HVAC and gotten a dirty job, you'd be a millionaire by now. You have to be able to speak to people in that way. And that's an unrigging question. So I just really want to like double click on what you said there.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, you ultimately have to sort of, you have to meet people at their spiritual core, and right, what people are looking for is not, just economic success. They're looking for meaning and purpose, right? A thing that they get up for every day. And that doesn't get solved by just a little bit of extra money in your pocketbook. That gets solved by connecting to the ways that people get fulfilled in their life. And I think the right has done a much better job of kind of diagnosing that spiritual emptiness that a lot of people in America feel and designing policies and messages that speak to that. Democrats, have not. So.
And what I will say for our last big question here, you and I share interest in a project, which is this project critiquing the neoliberal status quo. Whenever I do a topic on neoliberalism, I get a bunch of commenters basically saying, what is this? This is just high in the sky. You would never knock on doors if you're running for office and talk to voters about neoliberalism. But I would love to hear like why you think it's so important to focus on these quote unquote big ideas. Because from my perspective, I think the big ideas matter because I think they shape how we think about and approach the world. And if you're focused on the neoliberalism discourse, you're instantly focused on, wow, the status quo doesn't work. There is something missing. The way we talk about these issues doesn't resonate from people. And I think if I'm going to critique Joe Biden, I think the critique of Joe Biden is that he spent too much time with John Meacham and big popular historians who were talking about democracy and talking about this sort of Aaron Sorkin West Wing vision that I think because I'm so steeped in the status quo just does not work. And that is the top of a voter's mind, not this question of like, does democracy die in darkness? It was just so helpful to make me just sort of understand and really get that. So that's my personal pitch for why the big ideas matter. It centers you as a thinker. What's your sort of pitch for why folks should care about things, even if they wouldn't just go door knocking with handouts saying post-neoliberalism is the answer to America? Because I hate when people say that's what you're trying to say there, because that's not what you're trying to say. So I'd love you to just sort of take us away with that.
Yeah, and I've got a run, so I've probably got a lot to say on this, but I mean, listen, ultimately, we are, speaking both broadly to voters, and when I'm talking to voters, I'm not going to be talking about neoliberalism, but you're also trying to hold accountable leaders and policymakers. And I do think it's important for folks to understand that there was a worldview that was adopted by both the right and the left that went badly wrong, this blind faith in markets, this belief in sort of profit over common good, this unquestioning faith in technology as a net positive in all of our lives, this belief that ultimately boundaries between nations didn't matter, and that we could all be stitched together as global citizens. To me, I mean, there are more charitable ways to think about it, but in my more cynical moments, I do think that it's a fraud perpetuated on us by the masters of the universe, by the economic elites that benefited from that way of thinking of the world. And so I do think it's important to sort of understand that it's all part of a broader paradigm that serves a very narrow class of individuals, and that it was likely not true from the beginning, but that we all came to believe that those folks were smarter than the rest of us, and that what was good for them was good for the rest of us. And if we're going to construct something better, then we have to stop listening to the elites, because they have a history of trying to pretend that what's good for them is good for the rest of us. And I think in telling that story about all of these things, faith in markets, faith in global markets, the eradication of national boundaries, the erasure of localism, the blind faith in technology, all of that made us miserable. All of that made them powerful, more powerful. And when we construct the next system, we should just be listening to different people.
That is a perfect place to end. Thank you for joining me on the show, Senator.
Thanks, Marshall.